All right. Y'all behave, okay? You're not supposed to be laughing and having fun in a Bible class. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. There we go. It's not too bad there. Okay. Okay, well, we're continuing our class in the survey of Joshua and Judges, not taking a big deep dive into it. So we're going to take the next section. 1 through 12 was the conquest, moving from the wandering, coming into the land, and that whole process of conquest and the battle, which we saw was pretty interesting. I mean, we saw the conquest of Jericho and all the miraculous things about that, then their utter failure in taking Ai initially because of sin, and then we saw the judgment on Achan and his family, and then the successful, pretty brilliant defeat of Ai, and then the treaty that they engaged themselves in with the Gibeonites. It was a trickery, but they were faithful because they'd made a promise. And so they held to it, even though they were deceived. And so they went ahead and honored it. In the middle of this treaty time, all of a sudden we find that they're attacked. The Gibeonites are then attacked. And this starts the first wave of the southern invasion. And the 5 kings come and they start to attack the city of Gibeon. And in that forces the hand of Joshua to then have to take action. And so they march all night, they arrive, and with the help of the Lord, of course, threw them into disarray, which caused panic. And in their panic, they basically fled in a direction to put them in what I call a choke point or a kill zone, as we'd say in the military. And then the Lord just bombards them and destroys. And it said very clearly, it's kind of interesting, that more died by the hand of the Lord, basically, than what died by the soldiers of Israel themselves. They pursue them, and they capture 5 of the kings in a cave, seal them up, and pursue the rest of the organized resistance, defeat them, come back, and then open up the cave. And then Joshua ceremonially brings the kings out, lines them up, puts them on the ground, and then has the elders of the leaders, anyway, of the army come up and put their foot on their neck, showing that total submissiveness, and then executes them, hangs them on a tree, but brings the bodies down, because we know that that was something that was defilement of the land. It was a requirement of it. Then they swung north in the northern campaign. Again, there's a lot of things in the minutiae we could dig in and look at, but we know that there were cities that were designated to be utterly destroyed. We're never really given precisely why these cities, the 5 cities that were to be completely annihilated. We know Jericho was one, right? Jericho was one, that everything was to be burned and everything. And in that, the northern kings, what you see is this panic on all the inhabitants and the kings as well. But there's no stopping them. One thing I did talking about between the defeat of Ai, they go up to Mount Ebal, and they renew themselves in the reading of the law and the blessings and the curses. And that was something that showed that unification as well. They're not really, Moses started out, if you go back historically and look at their Genesis, where they came from, they come from the wandering from a slave state. They receive law, and then that wandering period is still building them, but they're really nomadic. They're not a well-established nation. They have the religious, they have a governmental structure, but it's run by, you've got the elders of the tribes, then you have the priesthood that's supposed to be taking care of the religious enforcement and education and all of this. And then you have Moses and that type of a governmental organization, but they're nomadic, they're moving around. So there's a transition, a big one. But the bigger one is the fact that now they've received this promise that goes all the way back to Abraham. And in that promise. Now, and remember as well, the reason that God waited over 400 years before they came and conquered the land was because the sins of the Amorites were not yet full. That's key. When people, they talk and they'll say, wow, the Israelites, they came in and they annihilated and genocide and they were barbaric and all. No, you know what? That was God's judgment. God's judgment was coming on them. He gave them an additional 435 years to get it right, and he tolerated them. So, I always bring that up because even I think Christians forget about the fact that, this is a judgment. This isn't just saying, well, I made a promise to give you some real estate, so I'm buying you a property. It's a judgment as well. And God allowed them the time. So, yes, it's horrific in the way that, people had to die and suffer, but it's a thing that God could not tolerate, this type of sinfulness and unrighteousness like Sodom and Gomorrah. So we need to keep that in mind. I don't know how far to take, when you say, when we look at total destruction and the Bible says that, they were to kill them all, but we know they didn't. But we're going to see tonight when we see the division of the land, we read through the first 12 chapters and we see where it's like, well, they conquered and did all that, but yet there's still some people around. It wasn't a sterilization order per se that we see they followed. So I can't say that they failed in that, but we do know that there were some we're going to see they should have. Now, just because you beat the army and you kill the king doesn't mean the land is all in peace. There's a lot, how many times has countries gone into places, destroyed the government, took it over, and still was at war for 10 years? We've done it in Afghanistan. We did it in Iraq. We did it in Vietnam. Just because we, destroy the organized resistance doesn't mean that there's not going to be some that escape off and are still pretty upset about what's going on. So now, even though it doesn't state it, but that is a natural thing that happens to any military. The Syrians, the Babylonians, we could go on and on. Just because you defeat it, we read the defeat of those kings and we read the destruction of those cities, doesn't mean that all was peace after that. And the occupation was so succinct and so quick as it occurred. So this next division, 13 through 21, it's kind of boring, I'll just tell you. It's And it's kind of like reading through, some of the genealogies at times. And we look at it and we just skip it. Or the detail of Leviticus and stuff over the old law and stuff. And to us, because we skip it, it shows that our relationship, one, we're not Hebrew, we're not Israelites, we're not living under the Mosaic law. It's not as important. But now American history is pretty interesting and very important to us. That's one of the problems we have in our nation today. I strongly believe it is that we don't know our own history. We don't understand the founding fathers and honestly some of their own writings. People don't know them, so they misinterpret, and then we're in confusion, and our country's in chaos because we've lost the history of it. But if you just go back and you look at the history and historical things and writings, it helps to ground you, and it's important to read those. It's incredible what you can quickly realign yourself and go, okay, this is what we are. And so that's what the Old Testament, the Torah, was for the Hebrews. So it was important. It was very important to list the genealogies, to list the inheritance, and even to go through something that's not really that boring, but when Jacob gives the blessings to all the sons, remember, he brings them in, and he blesses each of the head of the tribes. And in that blessing, there are so many things that are given to them that we're going to see even tonight. We're kind of not all of them, but a lot of that was fulfilled. So one of the things that we see is what? A fulfillment. God had promised it. Now, 433 years, Abraham's been dead long. So, we look at time and we sometimes think, when's God going to fulfill something? How long is it going to take, right? It's like we're on our schedule and we don't like God's schedule and we don't comprehend that, if the kingdom's coming, why isn't it here now? Are these different questions that even the Christians of the first century we see they struggled with as well. So this is a solid evidential presentation. As boring as it may be to us in a way, and we don't understand the geography and some of that, it does give us some insight. And so that's the kind of the key things is one, to look at, it answers kind of two practical questions, I think, in these chapters. Is one, how God distributes the inheritance among the tribes. We'll see that. And also then how God provides structure for justice and also leadership. And that's something that kind of comes out. And then there's some nuggets. They're just some of those little gold nuggets that you'll hear that we're going to talk about with Caleb. And some historical things that come up that if you take the time and read through, as monotonous as it may appear, there's some really cool little things that will come up that remind you of some things. So, we need to keep remembering that it shows us God is giving the promise, and God's in control as well. This is not a political decision-making process. It's not, who's, closer to Joshua. It's the influence and the way it's done. So the issue, though, by the time we get here, Joshua's already old. He's advanced in years. And we see that the land's still not really complete. Now, you say, well, that's what I was talking about. It's like earlier, well, didn't we finish where they had a northern campaign and they won, and they went to the, south. They won the north and south campaigns, but they haven't occupied it. What we find is they go to Shiloh, they establish the tabernacle, and it's going to stay there until, I think, those nasty Philistines take the ark and stuff. Shiloh is going to become the center for the worship. And so the tribes are all around there when all this is going on that we're reading about, and a lot of them, they kind of still like hanging out. They're not going and doing what they need to be doing. And so from verses 1 through 7, that's the Lord comes to Joshua. And he tells them, he goes, look, there's still a lot that needs to be done. You won the war, but you still need to you need to finish your side of it. Does that sound familiar? As Christians, sometimes, we win the battle of our sin, our death. We're reborn, and we just stop. Mm-hmm. We think, we've arrived. Whew, got those pesky sins all forgiven, and so now I'm good. And so that's kind of the problem that we see that they have as well. And so the conversation starts out and with the Lord coming to Joshua and telling him, there's still work to do. But now imagine here you are. Caleb's going to remind Joshua. That's what's kind of cool. We're going to spend a little bit on that because they're the only two, remember, that were of the original generation that came out of Egypt and that went in and spied the land out. And out of the 12 spies, it's only Joshua and Caleb that came back and said, we can do this. And the other 10 said no. And so the Lord said, fine, you're all going to wander, you're all going to die, but you two are the only ones that are going to get to go in. And so it's kind of cool because we're going to see that these two old men looking at each other and saying, hey, and Caleb's the one that's going to have that conversation.
Is there proof that Joshua was allowed in? Let me see, because Caleb in 14 says that he was one of the spies, but I read where someone was saying that it was Phinehas instead of Joshua. Where is it written that it was?
I don't have the specific reference at hand, but my understanding, I've always seen that those were the only two from the original that were.
It does say in 14 that it was that Caleb said, and I spied out.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what I always assumed myself.
Mm-hmm.
But I looked it up and it said others were saying that because it's not written that you find it. But someone was saying it was Phinehas. Why Phinehas? I don't know.
Phinehas?
Yeah.
Well, he was the priest, wasn't he? Phinehas. Well, Eleazar. Phineas. Or Phinehas. Yeah.
Oh, well, I'm just wondering if you knew.
I've just always,
Yeah, it was 14:7 where Caleb said, and I brought back word to him,
mhm.
you know, what I saw.
Yeah, he's speaking in singular that he had brought back and told Moses.
Right.
Yeah, but he's
I
not
know that.
excluding that Joshua was present.
True.
Yeah, but I've always, it's always been my knowledge that those were the only 2 of the 10 spies that were faithful in their standing up, and therefore that's why Joshua as well. But I'll dive into that and look and see. I'm not going to sit and say no. I've been known to be wrong before. So let me check our social media. I forgot to bring that over and see. And if you're with us, sorry, but please contribute, talk, drop your comments in, and we'll interact. So 1 through 7 and 13, the land still to be possessed, and the task is still continuing. 8 through 33 and 13, we see he talks about the tribes east of the Jordan. Remember, there were some of those tribes decided it was Reuben, Gad, and half of Manasseh had come to Moses and said, hey, we would like to stay over here. Moses had a spiritual meltdown, rightfully so, because he's like, we kind of did this before with the spying, where some of the spies, and he was afraid that it was going to invoke God's wrath, that they don't want to go over and take the land. So Moses ends up making a deal with them, but that was way before. And prior to that traveling over, then Joshua reminds them, okay, you got this from Moses, but you have to come over and you have to help us out. And so we see that the tribe area on the east side, the west side of the Jordan, Manasseh, Gad, and Reuben. Now, the half of Manasseh is going to be up there as you look at the map on the west side on the east side of Jordan as well. And so that inheritance is something that, as we go through this, is interesting because, again, the way that it's selected. The Levites are also brought into this, the idea that the Levites are not going to receive any territory. And in 33, verse 33 of 13, it says that the Lord is their inheritance. What does that mean? I mean, isn't the Lord your inheritance? So if you're a Levite, everybody's getting physical property. And they look at you, at the Levites, and, and if Joshua was to say, well, the Lord's your inheritance. What is that?
They get from all the land. I mean, people go take to the priest and to the temple. So what do they need the land for? Because all the people are bringing all the goods that God has given them for the temple.
Exactly. The Lord was their provider. I think if you had said that, the Lord is going to provide for you. Now, they do get property. It's not like they were renting apartments. They're actually given, but they're not given an inheritance like the other tribes. Here's your southern part, but they're going to be distributed. And within those, they're given land. And so they have area. But the focus was that the Lord was going to provide for them, and it was going to come through the temple service.
But in 33, it says, but Moses had given no inheritance to the Levi, to the tribe of Levi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's no inheritance for them. And so when he says that, the Lord is going to be their inheritance.
He's going to be their provider.
Yeah. They're not going to get the land. The land's not what you're going to get. What you're going to get is your service. And that's what's ironic, is that when we get into the period of the Judges, one of the things that really impacted the Levites was the fact that they were not contributing to the temple, and therefore they were starving. And we find Micah, the priest, that is wandering off and becomes a personal priest for somebody else. And it all goes back to the fact that their inheritance was not coming to them the way that it should have. And so, this is kind of a shadowing, isn't it? Of something, we always talk about the temple and how that, everything in the Old Testament has a shadow of the real thing. And we know that, in the New Testament, those who work full-time for the Lord and labor, how are we taken care of? You take care of them through what? The Lord is their inheritance in a way. It comes through the benevolence and the service, and the sacrifice of the contribution. So it has that kind of tie. And there are times where, unfortunately, I've heard of some situations where churches got mad at a preacher and they quit paying him. It's like, you got mad at him? Okay, was he insane? What? It's almost, well, I don't like the preacher, so I'm going to cut back on my contribution. To me, that is, no, you give it to the Lord and let the Lord work it out. How dare you inject yourself into the Lord's work in the sense that, it's almost like saying, well, I'm not taking my lambs up to the temple because those priests up there are corrupt. What? What do you think God would say about that? This isn't about the priest. This is about what you need to be doing in your sacrifices and service to the temple. I'll take care of the other side of this. And so it's kind of in a way that, now, not that the congregation shouldn't. I think, if there's a problem with the preacher, absolutely, we need to resolve those issues, those problems, and whatever the conflict is. But don't use, in other words, your contribution, what we need to individually be doing and providing to the church anyway. That's something separate. And so sometimes because it's money.
Yeah, I think a lot of people use the excuse, well, I'm not giving to the church, I'm not going to that church because it's just full of hypocrites and they're doing this, they're doing that. Well, like you said, that's not their problem. You give because that's you're commanded to give, from God to support the work.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't know what they're doing with the money. You just hope and pray that they're doing the right thing with the money. And yeah, as far as the hypocrites, well, where should they be? I guess in church, where they should be trying to get right.
Yeah, it's like an alcoholic. You go into Alcoholics Anonymous and you're telling them, why are they going there? Well, they need to be there, right? Hypocrites, where do they need to be? They need to be in church, right? To help fix that problem they have of hypocrisy. I mean, and you don't think there's 1,000 out there hypocrites anyway? Like you're protected from the hypocrites by not going to church?
No, there could be some in the church too as well.
That's what I mean, though. That's what I'm saying. It's reverse psychology. You're saying I'm not going there because they're hypocrites.
But then they'll go to work with.
But they go to work with the hypocrites,
Yeah, exactly.
right?
Yeah.
It's like, oh, so you're so much hypocrite free out there in your job, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you're going to use that against. But that's kind of, it's a little rabbiting away from our topic, but it does have to do with the idea of this idea. And it's brought up here where, your inheritance is not territorial, but it's going to come from the Lord. And so it takes amount of faith and service that the Levites need to be focused on and serving. And that you know what? If you're doing your job, then the people will be, right? They will be that was their purpose. Now, remember, the Levites aren't all priests. They're not all priests. They're part of the system, and they serve.
So they have to be from that tribe.
They had to be from that tribe, and especially then when we get into the high priest. It had to be a very specific Levite. It had to be one that was descended of Aaron to be a high priest. But it was so necessary for the function of the temple and everything that went on around the tabernacle that they needed those to do that.
Could you imagine if they said, okay, let's vote somebody in?
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, God had to be specific.
Mm-hmm. And, there's another thing is you didn't get a choice who your Levite was. All the Levites served. Let's get another tribe. There are better people than Benjamin. No, you don't. It's the Levites. Okay. So the covenant is what we're seeing as being fulfilled. So the land west of the Jordan in 14 is to be divided by lot. And it's not just random either. Something we need to remember is when we see that division that goes on, it's with the leadership. Eleazar, he's the son of Aaron. The high priest involved, Joshua's involved, and the head of the families are involved. And and they casted lots. Now, how does that sound to you, casting lots? What do y'all remember about casting lots?
Is that like gambling? Or betting?
That's what we would think today, right? Today, when you say that, you're casting lots, you're casting dice. I mean, that's our relationship culturally, is that, but this is not it at all. It may be because, well, one thing for sure, we don't know precisely what it was, the item itself, the instrument. There's some indications it was something in the form of like a die or rocks or something, but we really don't know. And it's probably better that we don't, because I bet you there would be a church that modeled them and was making sure they had the scriptural lots that, were exact color or shape or whatever it was. It's the process. And now think about it. Now, let's just go back to the dice in a way. When you take dice and you throw them, you don't have any control unless you're just, I know the loaded dice maybe, some have a little, they'll do a little something with the wrist, or, they'll go, okay, I throw it this way. But honestly, it's chance, isn't it? It's chance, snake eyes, or as they say, you really don't know what's going to happen when it lands and stops. So that's the concept as far as that part is when it comes to the casting of these lots, is that once you let go of them, it doesn't matter how you hold them, fold them, or whatever it was, or shake them 10 times. I remember like when we play Yahtzee, some people would sit there with that thing and then throw it, or have a certain way, with the die. They had their little rhythm to it, and thinking somehow, if they did it just so way, they'd get what they wanted out of it. There's no proof to any of the technique. No matter what you did, once it left your hand, it was airborne. And once it landed, it was fixed, wasn't it? It wasn't throwing them to somebody else and saying you catch them and then somebody like roll them around. No, once they hit and stopped, it was said. So that's what we're seeing happening. Now, the difference is the Lord is the one making them land the way they're going to land. You have lost control, in other words. You're out of, it's not in your, other than the hand that you did it, but you're physically doing it, but the Lord is the one placing them in the position when they hit the ground.
I remember when they were trying to pick another apostle after Judas was gone, they cast lots. And of course, God was the one that actually picked the one.
Now, those two individuals were picked,
Right.
right? But they had to meet the qualifications. And then between those two, same process, the lots. And so the Lord is the one that picked, which is important. So yeah, that's a good one, a good illustration that it all came all the way up into even the first century. But I think because we think of dice, we think of casting your lot, or, we say that. We use phrases like that. We cast your lot with, or the idea of throwing dice somehow. And it's kind of a little mysterious because of our culture. But the fact is, like I said, you're taking some items and you're tossing them. And when they're airborne, you've lost control of it. It's whatever, when it lands, and that's it. And it's done. So that was kind of the process. And so the trust was in the fact that whatever that answer was that they were looking at whenever they landed was the answer from God. It wasn't, hey, 2 out of 3, right? You could almost see, especially Benjamin, those guys were ornery. I'm picking on them. The Benjamites go, whoa, hey, don't we get a 2 out of 3 out of that? Can we throw again, so I can get some better land, or something? No, that's it, and to know that, it's not Joshua, it's not Eleazar, and it's not the leaders. That decision is God. So this is where then we talk about looking at the gift of land that was given to Caleb. When we go to 14, we see where he comes. We've already kind of been starting to talk about it. is the way that he comes and discusses it. Caleb is a mighty warrior, even at his age, if you think about it. He is a very strong man. He even says it. And then it says, we get there, when Caleb comes up to him, he says, you know what the Lord said to Moses, the man of God in Kadesh Barnea, concerning you and me. And so that's where I think, Becky, as well, it kind of supports the fact that Moses had said those two were the ones, also indicating that the showing of spies. He goes, we were 40 years old when Moses, the servant, the Lord sent me from there, to go spy out the land, and he's the one that came back. So he was 40. And then he goes through and describes a little more about the fact of them not accepting the report. And then Moses swore on that day, saying, surely the land on which your foot has trodden shall be an inheritance for you and your children forever, because you have wholly followed the Lord my God. Now he's testifying his right, his inheritance in a sense. It's not that he's excluding Joshua, because Joshua as well gets some real choice land too. And so, so for 45 years, he says, from that time. So he's 85 years old. And I'm as strong, he says in 11, today as I was in the day that Moses sent me. My strength is now as my strength was then, for war, for going and coming. So now give me the hill country, which the Lord spoke on that day, for you heard on that day. So the Anakim were the giants. So that he went into that area. In other words, that's where he also had gone. And he said, I shall drive them out just as the Lord said.
Did you say that the Anakims were giants?
Yeah, they're a part of the...
Okay. Of the Nephilim nation, pretty much of the giant nation? Okay.
And so he's saying that, because we know they didn't drive them out the first time.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say, because in 11, that's what it says.
Yeah, we didn't drive him out the first time. We failed. But now this time, but he walked that land, see? And so now I'm going to go get him. I'm going to go give me the hill country. The hill country is hard to fight in. It's not easy fighting. I mean, if you're going to fight, you want something a little less aggressive terrain. So, this old guy, and he's saying, I'm just as strong. And just imagine with his wisdom at his age, if he's got that physical and mental capabilities, he is definitely a powerful man in a lot of ways, in his wisdom and his strength as well. So Joshua did. He gave him Hebron. Now, Hebron's key because if we look at just even the location there, it's going to be enveloped by Judah. When we look at the area there. I don't have Hebron right there, but Hebron is also going to end up being the first capital when David becomes king and before he reunites everything, and because it's in Judah, but Hebron's in the south. But look at Jerusalem. Remember, we talked about Jerusalem. Jerusalem is going to remain occupied by the Jebusites until David. So nearly 150, 160 years before David comes along. So, and like I said, it's really amazing because it provided the Switzerland because nobody owned it before then. So it's kind of like, how did we pick where our capital's at? You go back historically and you look, where was our first capital? It was in New York. New York, wait a minute. I thought Philadelphia. And why did we end up in a swampland? Because Washington and the leaders said, we need a neutral place. Everybody wanted it somewhere else. But one of the reasons they picked Washington was one, it was literally, and even to this day, they have a lot of problems with water table, but it was swampland. Nobody really wanted it. And it was miserable when they built the Capitol and they moved it there. If you listen to some of the people who lived in that day and age, if you've ever gone to Washington, D.C. to this day in July in the summer, I don't know how they survived. It is miserable. insects, it's hot, it's humid, it'll kill you, just the temperature. That's why George Washington would go there and he'd get back to his home because it was terrible, but it was because it was neutral, is what I'm getting at. Well, and so isn't this amazing that, they didn't get the Jebusites out. They sat there for all that time. No tribe owned it. King David comes in when he takes it. He first goes to Hebron, but he realized real quick that everybody's going to go, yeah, well, you're showing favoritism because you're from the tribe and you had the capital down there and they're getting everything. No. So Jerusalem becomes it. And we know it's significant before any of this happens because Melchizedek, Abraham's sacrifice for his son, right? And plus the prophecies. We already know God already has a plan for it. So I keep bringing that up, but these are the things that sometimes we lose, as we're reading through some of the, what we call boring, overwhelming stuff. Simeon is going to be kind of placed in the middle of them, which is also a part of when you go back to Jacob, when he blesses all the children before he dies, he describes that. He says, you're going to be scattered among them. You're going to be mixed in them. And, they're the one tribe, if you look at all of it, they're in the middle of another tribe. Everybody else is boundary with another tribe and the river, the Jordan, or something like that. They're kind of jammed up in there. But the Jebusites, in 15 we see, 15 verse 63, but the Jebusites, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, the people of Judah could not drive out. So the Jebusites dwell with the people of Judah at Jerusalem to that day. Well, it says to this day then. So it's kind of as well describing the fact that it's kind of setting something up. But so again, we look at about when God says you got to purge, annihilate, remove everybody. But then we turn around and we see that God had a plan for this city. They weren't able to get rid of them. So did God lie? No. You have to go to the language interpretations, and that's where sometimes we can't always understand because, honestly, there's very, very few people that understand the original language of Hebrew. And so you got to be careful is what I'm saying as far as like when you try to read through the contradictions that appear to be when God said this, and then all of a sudden we see they don't. But again, like I said, there are some areas where, like he came and said, look, you're sitting around, you're not going out and taking the land. You still have some work to do on them. Look at the size as well, Judah. Judah ends up, and it's going to be what? Why is Judah important? It goes back to the blessing that was given by Jacob, that the king, royalty, the scepter will always remain with Judah. A lot of those brothers that were sitting there listening to these things when Jacob is saying them, their blessings, probably didn't get it. He describes Benjamin. When he blesses him, you're like a raven wolf. And when we look historically, what some of the things that the Benjamites do. So one of those was to Judah. Remember, when we start all the way back to the Garden of Eden with the sin problem, and God says, that I'm going to bring one that's going to come along that's going to defeat that rotten old snake, evil, Satan. That's all the plan they had. That's all they knew. And then all of a sudden we go through Noah, and if we didn't have the genealogies, in hindsight, we wouldn't know who is that person. We wouldn't even know how they came about. That's why those genealogies are so important. It confirms that he didn't just haphazardly go, oh, that's right, we have to have somebody come along that's going to be. No, God very clearly showed us how that promise was fulfilled. Yeah. And so that's why that was, when Jacob is sitting there prophesying, in a sense, in the blessings to those brothers, those 12, so many of those came out, and one of them was to Judah. And we know Judah was a rascal. Remember Tamar? Yeah. Tamar and what he did to his daughter-in-law and his sons and how rotten his sons were, that he ended up killing them. And then he just totally blew off Tamar and sent her away. And he goes and has a relationship because he thinks she's a prostitute. She gets pregnant and he wants to kill her, burn her. Come to find out, guess what, Judah? It's not a good picture. So it's interesting that when we look at some of these characters and we start to see the fulfillment, I always say, God is going to fulfill it in spite of us.
That's right, amen.
Right?
That's right.
I mean, it's going to happen. When you think the church is falling apart, no, it's not. The church of Christ, universal, it's not going to fall apart because we failed here in this one location or things like that. God is going to still fulfill, and that's what you see. So Judah, the rotten guy sitting there hearing, the scepter's always going to be, in your tribe. It's like, the lion. That's king. That's rule. And so when we start to see this coming out, guess who David comes from? You see? David comes from Judah. So we start to see we sitting here tonight, 3,000 years later, can sit and just enjoy and see the beauty of how God is starting to unravel that mystery slowly before us. And just even dividing up the land, we start to see things historically because we already live so far away and we can sit and look at these. Now, Ephraim, and this is one of the things that's interesting, is that they end up inheriting really the richest land. And Ephraim is going to be used as symbolic for riches and wealth and things like this. And the prophets will refer and sometimes say and call him Ephraim and looking at the glory and stuff because of what they were going to end up. And that's where Joshua is also going to be. We see in that as well, Ephraim and Manasseh in that area. But there's still that problem. We see the idea that they're still not driving them out. Partial obedience as well is brought up as we read through those chapters and how that is going to be something that's going to be a pain. That they did not get rid of the people that they should have got rid of. And it's going to corrupt them from there on. And the Philistines, we know the Philistines remained. Samson, even David, how many Philistines he killed. The Philistines become one of the greatest ones that we can look at and I can point out, show the idea. The whole idea was not necessarily that God was racist. The idea was the isolation for purity reasons. The corruption, remember, of the external influences by them then marrying and engaging with these other cultures who worship pagan gods. And God was like, no, I don't want you to have those relationships with those people because of what the influence is going to have. And guess what? From Judges on, we see that play out time and time again. That the corruption from the marital relationships between foreign, the same tribes where God said you should have kicked them out, they intermarry. Manasseh, Solomon, we can go on.
What I thought was interesting in chapter 15, where Caleb's daughter, where Caleb said, whoever beats this one, he who attacks Gurja Stepher and takes him, then I'll give my daughter to him to marry. And it's unusual for someone to give their daughter. She asked for land, and he gave it to her. That was in 15 and 16, 17. Usually it was just the men. That's what I'm trying to say. It's always the boys that always got it, or the eldest, or the females were, you're on your own to marry whoever. And whatever your husband gets, you get, but nothing from the family.
Yes. And, one of the things was the land that she was going to be going to was pretty arid down in the south, Negev, in that region. And so she ask, basically, hey, can we have this area here so that we're not, and yeah, there is that. There's also, we see in 17, another issue with the daughters of Zelophehad. The daughters of Zelophehad, he didn't have any sons. He only had daughters. And so they were initially giving them, because when we say like the tribe of Manasseh, well, there's a whole bunch of families. There's a whole bunch of sub-clans, tribes and families in that area. So once Manasseh's territory was established, it's like New Mexico, then we divided it into what? Counties. And then within the counties, we're divided into smaller areas of influence and power and authority and things. And so that's what went on, a lot that we're not seeing because we're seeing a larger level. But down in the lower level, even within some tribes, there were still that division of land going on. And so we find that Zelophehad, his inheritance, he had no one to give to according to the way it was going down. And so that was a problem. And it was easily resolved. No, the daughters then will receive the land that Zelophehad would receive. So, and now we also have the idea of some land requests because there were some of them, how can you go out and survey it like we do today? You send surveyors out, or you can do it by Google Maps, and you can measure and determine population density and things. So there was some of that going on where there was tribes that are going, whoa, we have so many people that we need more land. And so there was requests as well. And so what's interesting is that what Joshua instructs, I just lost words, between Judah and Ephraim, that buffer area that he establishes, but then there's that idea we need more land. Instead of giving it up, he tells them, well, you need to go out and clear out. You have it, you need to work it. Kind of like instead of saying, well, I'm going to go ahead and take away from this tribe and shrink theirs down. It was like, no, it's there, but you're going to have to go out and clear more property, in other words, in order to get the people to be able to reside there. So, so don't only ask for more, but also be willing to do the hard work of possessing the land. Was kind of the message that we see in 17 and through there. Benjamin was that smaller tribe that kind of becomes the buffer between the two. But again, you notice the difference between like what we saw with Simeon, where Simeon was just totally, like surrounded. But Benjamin being the smaller tribe, don't know why, we've never really given, but they're pretty significant. We'll see a few things. And that's where, especially like we're studying Isaiah, where we see we're down to, when we get to the division of the kingdom, the names and the tribes get absorbed into two larger ones, Israel, which was the 10 northern tribes, and then Judah, the southern. But Simeon and Benjamin is kind of absorbed and then becomes called kind of the Judah. So, and then all the northern tribes end up being called Israel. But then you'll hear Israel as well referenced to Ephraim because it's one of the tribes within the northern. So that's where sometimes we get a little lost on all these different names. We already actually kind of talked about this, but in 19, about the fulfillment of the prophecy with Simeon being in there and carved out kind of. In Genesis 49, verses 4 through 7 is where it talks about that fulfillment of that scattering. And they will assimilate over time, basically, into Judah. Zebulun gets the lower Galilee corridors, and those are important because those are trade corridors. So that plays into some things. And also a very historical area of Jezreel, the Valley of Jezreel. Also, today, reference in that area is Armageddon, the valley. The key battles that we see are in that region there. The other thing that's kind of obscured, and it seems like it doesn't match, was with Zebulun, was the idea in the blessings that were given to the boys again by Jacob in 49 of Genesis, verse 13. It says, Zebulun shall dwell at the shore off the sea, shall become a haven for ships, and his border shall be Sidon. And it was, I mean, it's kind of a part again, like I said, some of those prophecies, and they were fulfilled in there. Issachar got the richest part of the Jezreel Valley, west of the Jordan, and they became a major supplier of food. Now think about the hill country where Judah's at, some of the other tribes. It's kind of like we have a bread basket, where we say that in America, Midwest, Kansas and some of those consider that. In Europe, you know where it's at? Ukraine. Even Africa relies a lot on Ukrainian grain to supply. And so that's what Issachar was going to end up being with this great fertile valley that they were going to have. So each one of these is what I'm kind of as well showing is, even though they're getting their inheritance independently, there were responsibilities as a nation to help each other with. Whether it was the trade routes, you see, the fertile valleys in which they were going to have that others weren't going to have. So you can see where some of the political stress, if you're not united spiritually in God, could create these turbulent times between even the tribes because of the geographic location and the assets that they would have in their geographic location versus some of the others. And Asher was on the coastline. I want you to notice there's a little white line there, that little beige line there. That's where those nasty little Philistines kind of floated in, and they ended up being kind of on a coastal level as well. But that's a lot of the trade reactions. Remember, when you're traveling from Europe or like Turkey and around there to get to the African continent, get down to Egypt, which has always been a major resource and powerful nation, they traveled through right down the middle, but they traveled along through the routes through Asher, because why take the rocky, wavy, turny roads when you can travel flat and fast? So a lot of those trade routes were based on the geographics. Like that's why Jezreel, because it was a traversing point where they could travel through. And invasion as well as the army. We see that we talked about that with looking at the Assyrians, how they swept in. They swept along the coastline because it's fast and then turned back and came in. So Naphtali is the northern part, and so they have a strategic role in defense against the enemies coming up from the north there. Dan is vulnerable to attacks. But especially from the Philistines. They're going to be, even though we don't hear about it, but a lot of these conflicts that go on with even Saul end up being in that territory. They end up kind of being like a war zone, demilitarized zone, kind of not a great place. So they struggled. They struggled to maintain their allotment. That was one of the key things. Joshua gets the city of Tanath-Seir, and it was a special portion because of his leadership, which was a great place. So when we look as well, now we talked about it earlier, these cities of refuge. This is the place where the inheritance of the Levites were placed. What was their role? What was the cities of refuge?
For those who accidentally or did kill somebody, then they could go to that city. But then if the person who got accidentally killed or murdered, or if they stepped out of that city of refuge, then the people could go and kill them if they stepped out of that city of refuge. So you stay in there and you'll be saved until the
high priest. Yeah, and that's why I talk about the system of justice. Think about it. I mean, if a family, a cousin kills a cousin, you can see where the legal side of it, justice, is totally different if it's just the family controlling it.
Yeah.
So it allowed for a person who accidentally, or thought they accidentally, but somebody was murdered, that individual could travel to that. Now, if you look at them, they were really dispersed equitably. So it wasn't like, man, I'm sorry I live in this tribe because, man, if I kill somebody, I got 12 days to get to that city. And if they're faster than me, I'm dead man, a dead man running. But they were all really geographically positioned logically to where you could make it. Once you made it there, like Becca was bringing up, it didn't mean you were innocent. And as a matter of fact, if they found out that it was premeditated, scoot. You went out to the avengers of blood. I love the way it describes them that way. But if it was, but you were safe until the determination was made, whether it was accidental, or premeditated. If it was accidental, then you were protected. Only if you stayed in the city. And you had to remain in the city. And you read about where one guy decided to leave early. And it didn't go well for him. The Avengers were out there.
Oh, yeah.
So, but as long as they lived in the city, they were protected until they had to stay until the change of the high priest. I guess if it happened to me, I would hope he was an old man. I'm sorry, my mind is weird. I go squirrel a lot. But I thought about that. I thought, man, my luck, I would end up getting in trouble like that. And it'd be a young priest. And he'd live, and I'd be stuck here forever. But that's kind of interesting because what would mean that they were going to leave you alone, per se? But that was the law, was they were there. So it did. It kind of was to guarantee fair trial and also to then provide that balanced justice as well. Now, the Levites lived more than just there, if you look at it. And it's important what they were described. Why? One, we know that they served in the temple. So what? They were the closest to God in a lot of ways, and their job was involved in the law, in the church, in the Bible, you'd say. They should be the most spiritually minded individuals, and then they would serve and come back. Now, David orders them. He ends up, when he comes in, he sets a system up where they, it wasn't random. It was more organized and was brilliant the way he does it. But they basically would go serve so long and come home. Well, home was among everybody else. They were living in the world in a sense. So their influence should have been the same. Isn't that us? Right? We live where? We live everywhere, right? And so there's a part of our influence as well should have that on our community, the way the Levites. Are we not a royal priest? We've been going through 1 Peter, the same type of thing. So this is kind of talking about the purpose. No land, only city, set apart for religious duties, and just some of the history there. We'll move through that. So some of the main points we see in this overall, this section, is, again, reminding you that the minute detail that God is bringing forward, absolute fulfillment of that promise. Joshua 21:45, not one of the good promises which the Lord had made to the house of Israel failed. All came to pass.
That's what I was wanting to bring up, because why do people believe, like with the rapture, that they're going to go back to Israel and they're going to get this land? They're still saying that God hadn't given them their land. Mm-hmm. And in 43 it says, the Lord gave to Israel all the land which he had sworn to give to their fathers. So what are they saying, that God's a liar?
Yeah, and the other thing, part about the land promise was all of these promises. Remember when they were at Mount Ebal? What did he say? All of it is covenant conditional. You have to obey. Mm-hmm. You break the covenant, you lose it.
That's right.
I think 70 AD kind of brought that up when Titus marched through and destroyed it and burnt it and scattered it. And then by 110, when Trajan finally said, that's it, and he literally exported anybody Jewish completely off the land. Mm-hmm. And so they're, like you said, they're kind of coming back around saying, whoa, the Old Testament said, we have this land. Well, you did. He fulfilled it. And you're right, that's a good point to bring up. The fact that he points out very clearly.
They didn't fulfill what to God.
That's right. He gave them the land.
That's right.
And if you really get technical, go back and look at the amount of land that God said you're going to have. It went all the way up to the Euphrates, all the way down to the Aqaba, almost to the Nile. They never took that. They never did. Solomon, with David, after David had basically defeated everybody and killed everybody, nobody with no more enemies, when Solomon came in and ruled, he expanded it the furthest north. But they didn't hold it. Was that God? Failure? Again, no, we can't say that. So, but we're quick to turn it on God, aren't we?
Yep.
You know, all those problems. The other thing is the leadership, the spiritual leadership that we see with Joshua, Eleazar, and the way that it was handled, the way God also provided in this distribution of the land. He provided a way of putting the Levites out there to help to give them to it. In 20 verse 2 and 3, speak to the sons of Israel, saying, designate the cities of refuge for which I have spoken to you through Moses, that the manslayer who kills a person unintentionally without premeditation may flee there and may become a refuge from the avenger of blood. That's what I love, the avenger of blood, the avenger of death. So God has provided it in all of it, all the way around. So those are kind of the key things. Again, like I said, it's not necessarily the most exciting. It's kind of overwhelming because it can be looked at that way, but looking at it overall, that's one of the bigger picture things why I wanted to do kind of this survey this direction. So next week, we're going to look at the last of Joshua. It's going to shift over from that big picture down to, more specific shifts of unity, worship, the covenant renewal, and then Joshua's farewell, what's going to happen there. And then we're also going to talk about the misunderstanding of this altar that was set up by the tribes when they crossed back over. They set up a big altar as a memorial. The other tribes have a spiritual meltdown like Moses did, thinking, oh man, there they go. They're setting up a different altar. So we're going to talk about that challenge that they thought was going on. And the way they handled it is what's important too. So go ahead and read 22 through 24, last couple of chapters, and then we're going to move over into Judges. So before we leave, let's go ahead and have a word of prayer. I didn't start with, I got wound up and going. Our most gracious Father, we thank you so much for this time that we've been able to study your word and to look at this overall and to understand and see the evolving delivery of your blessings and your promises and the fulfillment of it, and how we take those promises and sometimes we're not fulfilling them and going and working those promises, and we fall short. And unfortunately, we seem to turn that on you, and somehow you've let us down, but it's us. Hopefully, we've learned that in this lesson tonight. We thank you for this time. We ask this in Jesus' name, amen. All right, we hope to see you 9:45 Bible study. We're in the Gospel of Mark, 10:45 for worship. Thank you very much.